Hi everyone, Coach Sipho here, and welcome to the 100 Ways of Dying at Chess series. Because there are very few people who have long concentration span, today we are going to focus on the first 10. So without wasting any more time, let's dive into it. Number 1, let's start with this position. You will see this position again and again from the beginner's games. It all starts with pawn to e4. Black replies pawn e5, knight f3, a normal developing move while simultaneously attacking the pawn on e5. Now, most beginners defend that pawn the wrong way with pawn to f6. Pawn to f6 weakens this diagonal and it takes away the knight square. The best way to punish this is knight takes e5. Pawn takes e5, then you play queen h5. The reason you sacrificed the knight is that you were trying to clear the diagonal because the knight was blocking your queen and you were also making that pawn soft. So you sacrificed your knight following with the queen h5. Black has two options to get out of check. Black can move his or her king, or they can block the check with their g-pawn. Let's start with pawn to g6. You will play queen e5, forking the king and the rook. So it doesn't matter how black gets out of check. At the very least, you will get a rook and a pawn for your knight. Okay, let's see what happens if black doesn't get out of check by blocking with the pawn. What if black plays king to e7 to get out of check? Well, in that case, you will play queen takes e5. Still, the only way to get out of check is to play king f7. The next move is bishop c4, checking the king. Now, the only move for the king is to go there because pawn to d5 doesn't really help because you would still take the pawn and check. So most players will play king g6. In that case, you will play queen to f5, check. Now pay attention, the only way to get out of check for black is to play king to h6. So you will introduce a new piece to the attack by playing pawn to d4. A discovered check to the king. So most players will block the check with a pawn to g5. So now you will introduce a new piece which is the h rook. Pawn to h4, taking advantage of the pinned g5 pawn. So you play pawn to h4. It doesn't matter. Now there are 3 white pieces attacking that pawn against 2 black pieces defending it. So your opponent is most likely gonna bring another defender to the pawn. In that case, you will take, which is a discovered check. So black doesn't have time to take the pawn since it is a check. Now the only way to get out of check is to play king g7. And you are going to play queen f7. And that's a checkmate. Lesson to be taken from this is that when your e5 pawn is attacked by the f3 knight, you never defend your e5 pawn. You never defend your e5 pawn with the f pawn. This is a suicide. So you defend that pawn with a knight. This develops a piece while defending a pawn at the same time. At the very least, you could use that pawn, but never use that pawn to defend your e5 pawn. From now on, I want you to think of forget when you see the f pawn. When you see that f pawn, f should mean forget moving it. So you never move that pawn. It leads to many tactics. As you will see that we'll also deal with another advanced tactic which has to do with moving this pawn. The second way of dying at chess comes from the puzzle we had at our last week's video. Black just played rook d8 in this position, which looks like a normal move, putting a rook on an open file and attacking the white queen. Now, most players would simply get out of that attack by playing queen c1 or rook to d2. But there's a tactic in this position, and I'm so disappointed that most players couldn't solve this puzzle from last week's video. The best move in this position is to play queen takes the rook. If the rook takes back, now you have a back rank checkmate. After rook takes, then your queen takes, it is a checkmate. Lesson to be taken from this is that whenever there are open files and the rooks could move up the board, you should make sure that your king has a window. For example, you should always open a window for your king to escape. Okay, someone might argue, but black opened a window. But what is the point of having a window if you are going to put a burglar on it? Because the king cannot escape because of that burglar. So make sure you have an open window for your king to escape. The third way of dying at chess comes from the position we once analyzed from one of our videos, the Queen's Gambit accepted variation. So it goes like this: pawn d4, pawn d5, you play pawn c4 now. This is the Queen's Gambit. If black doesn't take the pawn, let's say play pawn e6, it becomes the Queen's Gambit declined variation. But for now, we are going to focus on the Queen's Gambit accepted variation, since most players are so materialistic, so they will take the pawn. In that case, you will play pawn e3, attacking the pawn with your bishop. In most cases, most players will defend that pawn. So you are going to undermine that defender. If they defend with this pawn, of course, you are going to take, they take, and you are going to win a free rook. If they defend with this pawn, in that case, you are going to take, and then you attack the rook, which has nowhere to run. So you will win this game. The lesson to be taken from this is that there is nothing wrong playing the Queen's Gambit accepted variation. But if you take the pawn, you should never attempt to defend that pawn. If you want to learn more about the Queen's Gambit accepted variation, we have a full video about it, so I will pin it on the description. Now let's go to the fourth way of dying at chess. The fourth way of dying at chess comes from the fool's mate, even though I don't like the word, but it is called the fool's mate. This one really depends more on your opponent. Now, most beginners like pushing the f pawn. It's the f pawn again. Pay attention, it is the f pawn again. So what you will do, you will continue with your development. When they play this, guess what? It is already a checkmate. Lesson to be learned, again, forget moving the f pawn. The f pawn leads to many problems. So now let's go to the fifth way of dying at chess. Now, the fifth way of dying at chess comes from the scholar's mate. I doubt there's any good chess player who has never been a victim of the scholar's mate. The scholar's mate starts with pawn e4, pawn e5, bishop c4. Now, most players also refer to this opening as the four moves checkmate. Bishop c4, attacking the most vulnerable point in the opponent's camp. Now, most players play anything. Let's say knight c6. Your next move is bishop queen h5, piling more pressure on that weak point. Now, most beginners never ask what is the opponent up to. So they were told that in the opening you need to develop pieces, but they do it blindly. So they play knight f6, after which queen takes f7, checkmate. Now let's go to the sixth way of dying at chess. The sixth way of dying at chess is the smothered mate. The smothered mate comes after this move. Pay attention, it has to do with the f pawn move again. Forget moving that pawn, guys. So white plays pawn f3, trying to neutralize the knight on the e4 square. So what will black do is to not react, but ignore the opponent's threat a little bit and focus on his or her counter attacks or forcing moves. So Black won't run away, but black will play queen b6. Check. Blocking with the rook or blocking with the queen doesn't help because black will simply take those pieces and it will still be a check. So your opponent is most likely gonna play king h1. In that case, the opponent will play knight f2, forking the king and the queen. The only way to get out of check is to play king to g1. Now, we win the queen? Wrong. We are not going for the queen. We are going for that king's throat. So what you will do here, you will play knight h3, double check. So if it is a double check, the only way to get out of check is to move the king. If the king goes to f1, it leads to a checkmate because the queen is defended by the knight. But if the king doesn't go there and goes to h1, in that case, you sacrifice your queen, queen g1. The king cannot take the queen because the queen is defended by the knight. The only way to get out of this check is to take the queen with the rook, after which you play knight f2, checkmate. This is called the smothered mate because the white king is blocked by its own pieces, so it cannot get out of check. The lesson to be taken from this, again, avoid moving the f-pawn. If you remember very well, all this started when black played pawn f3, moving the f-pawn. Guys, let's avoid moving the f-pawn unless it is well calculated. The seventh way of dying at chess comes from my very own game, which I played a long time ago against my old friend who used to beat me a game after game after game. So after reading my first chess book by Gambit, I learned about this idea. So in this position, you can actually take the pawn on e5. If black takes your knight, you will win your minor piece back plus a pawn on top because I won the pawn on e5. But in this position, my opponent did not take my knight. Instead, he took my queen. Not knowing that there is a checkmate after bishop takes f7. The only way to get out of this check is to play king e7. Now, after knight d5, it is a checkmate. Now, the lesson to be learned from this is that you need to develop your pieces ASAP. Stop moving pawns like h6 and a6. Because as you can see in this position, let's go back to the position. In this position, you can see that white has 3 minor pieces developed. And on top of that, it is white's turn. Black wasted time moving unnecessary pawn moves. These moves are just a waste of time. In the opening, the main plan is to develop your pieces, do castling, connect your rooks, and start attacking. Don't move a lot of pawns, otherwise you will be punished. Now, I know someone might be saying, but Coach Sipho, you also moved your pawn on h3. Well, I moved my pawn on h3 because my opponent's bishop was on g4. And with the bishop on g4, this tactic doesn't work. Because after knight takes e5, the queen cannot take the bishop since it is defended by the knight. So I had to drive my opponent's bishop to a square where it won't be so I had to drive my opponent's bishop to a square where it wouldn't be protected by the knight after knight takes e5. This 8th way of dying at chess is not only for beginners. Even very strong players fall for this one. It starts with pawn d4, pawn d5. Now you play the queen's gambit. Opponent plays queen's gambit declined variation. So you just develop your pieces. Opponent plays there. you play bishop g5. Now, you play knight d7. Most players fall for this, thinking that, well, I have two pieces attacking the d5 pawn, and my opponent has only one piece defending the d5 pawn, since the f6 knight is pinned. Remember, a pinned piece cannot move, right? Pinned piece cannot move. So they would take, opponent takes, take the pawn, since the f6 knight is pinned. Remember, the knight cannot move because black would lose the queen. But in this position, you actually take the knight as black, temporarily losing the queen, but you immediately gain your queen after bishop b4. The only way to get out of this check is to block with your queen. So you regain your queen and then take that bishop. After the dust has settled, you will notice that black has an extra minor piece. So black will win this game with his or her extra piece. The lesson to be learned from this is that you need to double check your variations, and you never stop calculating until the end of the forcing line. As long as there is still a forcing move, a check, a capture, or a threat, you never stop. You calculate up until the end. The ninth way of dying at chess comes from the French defense advanced variation. By the way, if you are still enjoying this, please consider hitting that subscribe button. So it comes from pawn e4, pawn e6, French defense, pawn d4, pawn d5. Now white plays pawn e5, advanced variation. So we know that when the center is closed, we need to attack on the flanks, especially the base of the pawn chain. Now white usually plays this, and black will put more pressure on that base. And then white plays this, and then black puts even more pressure on that pawn. After this move, now let's see how many attackers black has on that pawn. 1, 2, 3. And white has 1, 2, 3 defenders. So there is an equilibrium. Everything is balanced. So in this position, there is a typical trap that white players usually make here. They usually play bishop to d3. Now you will notice that black still has 3 attackers, and white has only 2 now, because with that bishop, the queen's way is blocked. So black usually takes, and think, I'm winning a free pawn there. They will take the pawn, you take the knight. After this, it's a discovered attack on the queen, and black will lose the queen. The 10th way of dying at chess comes from the normal opening called Guscio Piano, or the Italian opening. It comes after e4, e5, knight f3, attacking the pawn. Opponent plays knight c6, defending the pawn. Now white will play bishop to c4, attacking the most vulnerable point in the opponent's territory. Now, most beginners play knight f6. Of course, you can play that move. It is playable. But after knight g5, it is very difficult to defend that pawn. It leads to the very complicated fried liver variations, which I don't recommend for beginners. So instead of, after bishop c4, instead of starting with the knight, I recommend that you start with the bishop. Now, what is the difference? The difference is that if you start with the bishop, the queen is still guarding that square. So white won't be able to go to g5 since the queen is guarding that square. But if you start with the knight f6, you block the queen's way to g5. So the opponent will be able to play knight g5, putting pressure on that pawn. So I recommend that you start with bishop g5. Now, most players maybe will play pawn d3, protecting that square so that they will be able to play knight g5. But they will play knight f6 now. If the opponent plays knight g5, it is too late because the bishop is not there. So you can just castle, bringing the second defender. So this is how you avoid dying from the 10th way of dying at chess. Thank you for watching this week's video. This channel is committed to uploading at least one video per week. And if you enjoy it, please don't forget to smash that subscribe button to help us grow. And if you've ever lost or won using one of these ways, please don't forget to let us know on the comment section. Which one is it? Thank you. See you next week. Peace.